Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Today I'm going to continue talking about Lurianic Kabbalah. Last episode we discussed, according to Lurianic Kabbalah, why God decided to create the world. Today we're going to talk about the mechanism for how this creation took place according to Lurianic Kabbalah. Now before I get into that, I just want to ask, if you like this podcast, please like it or leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast. You can also comment on it on YouTube. Thank you so much. Now on to today's episode. What was the mechanism through which God created the world according to Lurianic Kabbalah? To be clear, Lurianic Kabbalah is not really philosophy, but it's difficult to have this conversation without bringing in philosophy. Because there are certain assumptions that Lurianic Kabbalah makes that really seem to acknowledge the philosophy and conversations that preceded it, and also then take a position without getting into the philosophical argument. So it's worthwhile just giving a little bit of background here. And that is the idea of the eternity of the universe. According to Aristotle, the universe is eternal. There was always eternal matter here, and the world, as we know it today, was created out of this eternal matter. According to Maimonides, the Jewish philosophical view on this, the world was created ex nihilo, something from nothing. And that is based on the Torah, the Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Maimonides acknowledges the arguments that Aristotle makes about the eternity of the universe and says that if Aristotle was able to prove his argument that the world was eternal, he would reread those passages from Genesis in line with the view that the world was eternal and there was always matter there. But in the end, he says that Aristotle's view is not fully convincing, and therefore he maintains that the world was created something from nothing. Now, the question is what something from nothing really means. Even till this day, there are physicists and astrophysicists who think that the world may have been created something from nothing. As a matter of fact, the further we get back in time towards what's known as the Big Bang, the more esoteric these arguments become. It becomes metaphysical arguments. Metaphysics and mysticism are really closely related subjects. So just to acknowledge this very long argument that has been going on all the way from the time of Aristotle of how the world came into being, what was that mechanism? Was it something from something, or was it something from nothing? Interestingly, even if we say it was something from nothing, what does that nothing really mean? Because according to Aristotle, for example, this idea of the ability for something to be non-moved, so if you have something which creates something, that thing needs to move in order to create something, and if that thing can't move because it's nothing, then how can it create this something? Which is one of his arguments to say that the world is eternal. Not everyone agrees with that argument. There's the argument that God can and has the ability to be an unmoved mover, so he can move something without moving himself. And so that's the other side of the argument. But it's really a very long, deep argument for the eternity of the universe or against the eternity of the universe. We're not going to get into all that here, but to acknowledge the fact that this is something in a debate which has been going on forever. The reason why I bring this up is because in Lurianic Kabbalah, there is a conversation where he brings a Mishnah in Chagiga, which talks about the things that one should be able to talk about in front of people and those things which one shouldn't talk about in front of people or only with a select group of people. And one of those things which shouldn't be spoken about in public is this idea of what took place before the world and what will happen after the world. So what was here before the world was created? And that conversation, according to the Mishnah in Chagiga, should not be spoken about in front of a lot of people. It should be spoken about only to the initiated and only to the select few. The Lurianic Kabbalah gets into this, and Chaim Vital in the Eitz Chaim says, well, we're going to get into that conversation, but I'm going to do it in a way which is hidden and very quickly. And he says, I'm going to just kind of give a little bit of a peek into this philosophical debate of what happened before the universe was created. And he then goes on to talk about the Or Ein Sof. And he says before everything happened, there was this thing called the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. And we spoke about that as well a little bit in previous episodes. He says this infinite light is something which is pure and simple, and no one can ever comprehend it or understand it. It is higher and beyond everything that exists and prior to everything that exists, and it exists forever and ever. It didn't have a beginning and it didn't have an end. And that is what was before the world was created. And the idea here is that there is this very simple light which has no form, which existed before the world was created. That is what was always here and will always be here in some kind of sense, according to the Kabbalah. This, though, brings to mind a problem because, well, didn't we just kick up the problem another level? So the question is, well, what created that thing? And what does something from nothing really mean? Is this thing really nothing? Well, it could be nothing in the sense that there's no way we can explain what it is. It's totally unexplainable. It's just pure light, simple light that has no beginning, has no end, and nothing that we could ever comprehend in our mind. It's not comprehensible to humans. And in that case, it's nothing as far as we're concerned, because we can't explain what it is, and therefore for us it's nothing. In relation to any other being that we can start to have a comprehension of, that we can consider something, but that light is nothing. So therefore that something which we can comprehend came from that nothing. And it's interesting that Kabbalists sometimes refer that to the true something. So compared to that true something, which is the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, all of creation is nothing, because it's nothing comparable to that true something. So they call that sometimes the Yesh HaAmiti, the true something, and that the true nothingness. So the idea of creation ex nihilo is actually in Hebrew called Bria Yesh Mi'ayin, which means creation Yesh, something, Mi'ayin, from nothing. And sometimes they say, well, really the creation is nothing comparable to the true something, which is Or Ein Sof. But the question then is, well, okay, we might not understand what this is, and maybe according to Aristotle, and especially according to current day metaphysicists who consider before the Big Bang there was this emptiness, and particles that existed back then, the negative and the positive particles that existed, which were negating each other consistently, which is one theory of what happened before the Big Bang, but no one really knows. So really that nothing, which was before the Big Bang, if we can't understand what that is, and we don't understand what Yesh Mi'ayin is, what the Or Ein Sof is, then really these are two things we don't understand, so maybe they're the same thing. It's really interesting, because as you get closer to metaphysics and get that far back in time, the time of the Big Bang, billions and billions of years ago, you get really into very similar kind of conversations that the Kabbalists had. This idea of eternity of the universe or not eternity of the universe is really a little bit of a mute question, because if you think about it, let's say, we're using language here. We're saying that the world was a creation, and then before that you have the creator, which is the ayin, which is the nothing. So, and that we have no idea what that is. We can't explain what it is, but we're just saying this is something and that's nothing. You got creator and creations. Well, since we don't know what creator is in any kind of way, so when you get to the idea of, well, what happened before the Big Bang, for example, then we don't know what that is either. So they're both nothingness in that sense, and therefore you get some kind of overlap here. The idea here is that by saying this is creator and not creation, even though we don't know what it is, you're saying that something always existed. And that thing which always existed, we're calling it God, but we don't really know what that God is. We can't really describe it in any kind of way. It has no beginning, no end, is this pure thing. Then because of that, we just moved it into a different realm, used different language about it, but we're still saying this thing that created that thing is eternal. So the arguments are really very similar when you get down to it. And because even those who say that there was eternal matter there, they have no idea what they mean when they say eternal matter. And they admit that they don't know what they mean by that. So it's a really interesting convergence, in a sense, between these different strands of thought, and ultimately no one really knows. So now we're talking about the Lurianic Kabbalah, so we're going to describe what he means there. So with that kind of background, let's get into it. So according to him, according to Lurianic Kabbalah, according to Rabbi Chaim Vital, the world was created at a moment in time from this nothingness, we're going to call it, Ayin, this Or Ein Sof, this infinite light. Now the question becomes, well, why was it created at that time in particular? So we've done away with the idea that there was eternal matter there, whatever that means. And at some point in time, you had this act of creation. Again, the physicists will agree. At some point in time, you had the Big Bang. There was some cataclysmic event that took place that brought all we know today into being. The question the Kabbalists are asking is, why did it happen at that time? And the answer is somewhat unsatisfying, but it's worth thinking through. So why was the world created at that particular moment and not before and not afterwards? And the answer, he says, is because there has to be some kind of sequence of events that take place from a point in time for the world to be created. So there is the first thing that became created, this big light, he calls it, the light of all the biggest lights. And later on he calls it Adam Kadmon, and then Atzilut, these different kind of universes which became created from the big light. And then he also talks about how that occurred in the Tzimtzum, which is a great contraction. But today I'm going to focus on why did it happen at that point. And the answer is because it has to start at a point in time, and that creates a chain reaction of effects that takes place until the physical world comes into being. And that chain reaction has to happen step by step and moments in time. So the first emanation has to happen, and in order for the second emanation to happen, the first one must happen. In order for the third one, the second one must happen. In order for the fourth one, the third one has to have happened. And all the way down till this physical world is created, they all have our chain reaction, Seder Hishtalshalut, they're called, in order for the physical world to come into being. And one cannot happen before the previous one occurred. And everything starts at a point in time. So that's how he answers the question. If you think about it, though, it doesn't really answer the question of why did the first one happen at that time. It does answer the question of, well, how the physical world came into being at a point in time because something else must have happened before it. But then we can go and take the question further back and further back. Well, why did that first event, where the first emanation happened, why did that happen then and not prior? And if you think about it, it becomes very difficult to understand this concept of a moment in time when you're talking about something that is totally beyond time. So if you're talking about the Or Ein Sof, which is this simple light, as we mentioned, doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end, doesn't have any kind of form, is impossible to comprehend. That's what existed then. And then it says in the Eitz Chaim, Rabbi Chaim Vital, the Lurianic Kabbalah says, V'achar kach, in Hebrew we use the words V'achar kach, and after that. And after that, what does it mean after that? I've been finding it very difficult to get my head around what he means when he says, and after that, because how can you have after something that is totally beyond time? You're using language of time relating to something that doesn't have the concept of time associated with it. So how could there be this point in time that takes place from something that is beyond a point in time? These are some of the very difficult things for us as humans to comprehend. And it brings to mind the idea of, in Zen Buddhism, you have this idea of a koan, where you have these two things which are almost impossible to hold in your head at the same time. They seem like they're contradictory. So this idea of having a point in time for something that is totally beyond time is almost impossible for humans to get their heads around. So the question of, well, why did it happen at this time? And the answer it gives is, well, because it needs to have this chain reaction and it has to have a sequence in time until the physical world comes into being, doesn't really answer the question, why did the first emanation take place at that point in time? And how can you have a point in time related to something which is totally beyond time? So it's very difficult to comprehend, but the more you meditate on it, the more it fills your mind with an awe. And it's really a wondrous idea. The other part of this, which is really fascinating, is the language which it uses for this point in time when the first emanation took place. And it actually comes from the Zohar itself, where the Zohar says, Kad solik beru'usa limivrei alma, when it came upon his will to create the world. And Lurianic Kabbalah translates it as Kasha'ala britzono hapashut livrei olamot, when it came upon his simple will to create worlds. This opens up another whole can of philosophical questions about this idea of, well, if this light is simple and totally beyond any kind of comprehension, what does it mean that it has a will? What does that mean, that it has a will? What is this simple will that we're talking about? So at some point, according to Lurianic Kabbalah and according to the Zohar, there ascended within the divine, within this Or Ein Sof, a simple will to create the worlds. And last episode we discussed the reason for that. It wanted to show its glory. The way it was prior to that, it had its glory in potential, and it wanted to show it in actuality. That's what we discussed last episode. So at some point, it aroused within his simple will, within the simple will of the Or Ein Sof, to create the worlds. And then, after that happened, there was the creation of the worlds. There was an emanation of this first great light, and then lots of other great lights afterwards, until that Seder Shtalshalut, that emanation upon emanation, and then this chain reaction took place until the physical world came into being, and that was the fruition of that desire to create worlds. But let's get into this a little bit deeper, because it's really fascinating. We've mentioned in the past the Kabbalistic ideas of zivugim, or cohabitations between masculine and feminine. We discussed it in depth when we talked about the reason for the shaking of the lulav on Sukkot. This idea of this will, this arousal of a will, which the Kabbalah talks about, is one which you can tell the Kabbalists, they're struggling with, because in their worldview, you have zivugim, you have masculine and feminine are drawn to each other in a certain sense, and through the cohabitation of the masculine and the feminine, the next thing is created. So in the Kabbalistic worldview, a lot of what we're doing is to create these circumstances which allow for the cohabitation for the masculine and the feminine energies in order for divine energy to flow forth. But what if you don't have the feminine? What happens then? The Kabbalists think that in the Or Ein Sof, in the infinite light, when that was on its own, before the creation of the universe, that was only masculine energy and no feminine energy at all. And this idea of there was an arousal, that idea is that there was a masculine arousal for the feminine, even though there was no feminine in existence. So the world was created because in the divine itself, there was a arousal for the feminine without there yet being a feminine in existence. So God wanted to express his energy, his masculine energy, in a way in which it would be accepted by the feminine. And the idea here is that if you were a male and you existed on your own and there was no women around, would you still have a desire to be with a woman? And according to the Kabbalists, the answer is yes. You don't have to have women there in order for a man to feel the desire to cohabitate with a woman. The very fact that you are male means that you're going to want to cohabitate with a woman, even if you don't know that feminine exists whatsoever. You would want to create that feminine in order to cohabit with it. Even if there was no female, male would want to create it. Male would not want to be on his own. He has the innate desire for the female without there actually needing to be a female there. That's the way the Kabbalah looks at it. Again, I'm not making a judgment on this necessarily. I'm not expressing my own opinion, but this is the way the Kabbalah looks at it. So if you think about it, in the divine, there was only the masculine, and there was no feminine there whatsoever. That first emanation was an expression of divine masculinity to want femininity. And it gets into the details of what that femininity really is. This brings up a whole additional question, which is, one second, didn't we just say that this was a simple light that no one could describe in any kind of way? Aren't we now saying that there's a will within it? Aren't we saying that that's masculine energy? What about the idea that this is totally simple? The other philosophical question which comes up here is, well, one moment, is there two aspects in the divine? Is there the divine as it is, and then the divine as it is moved to want to create the universe? And if we're saying that there's two aspects in the divine, is that some kind of dualism? These are questions which the Kabbalists really need to grapple with, because as you get closer and closer to the divine itself, and the more you start to try and say and explain something about it, the more you open yourself up to saying things which can infer some kind of duality in the divine. So if you think about this, there is this divine, simple divine, and he uses this word, Kesha'ala birtzona hapashut, when it came up upon his simple will. The idea of the simple will and this simple, pure light. But as soon as you start saying things about it, it becomes less simple. And that is one of the challenges with some of these ideas here. But clearly, the Kabbalists don't seem to acknowledge any of these challenges associated with it. For them, this is just the way it is. And it's really interesting that even the philosophical questions, they're considered to be ideas discussed by the philosophers. But then when it talks about Kabbalistic questions, and we'll get into that at some point in the future, about the sphirot, attributes of the divine which emanated, what are their shapes? Are they in straight lines or are they in circles? Those are considered to be like the really big and important questions, because in the Zohar, it seems to imply this way, and then it seems to imply that way, and what does it really mean, and how do they work together? Those are much bigger questions that the Kabbalah, and specifically Lurianic Kabbalah, wants to grapple with. The philosophical questions it doesn't want to grapple with. So to understand that most of these ideas are based on texts that are revered, like the Zohar, and then obviously texts from the Torah and the Nevi'im and Ketuvim from the Bible. These are revered texts. They are revelation of the truth. And then the question is, how are we to understand these texts? And the debates around what the meanings are. But the philosophical questions are not of that much interest, so they're glossed over. But here on this podcast, we want to look at it with more nuance. And if we think about these ideas, it does infer, in a sense, some kind of duality in the divine. You've got a masculine aspect, which is distinct from a feminine aspect. You've got this masculine aspect in the Or Ein Sof, which has a desire for the feminine. And there is a moment in time when that desire takes place, although it's difficult to talk about time for something which is beyond time. But that moment when that happens, although it's above time, has implications on time and the moment the world was created. So something happened in the divine. What caused that to happen? According to some people, it's just a desire. It's an innate desire. Just like men will have an innate desire for the feminine, no matter what. There's just an innate desire. It's always there. But then the question is, well, what happened that caused the desire at that moment to come to fruition where it wasn't before? And it also used the language kasha'Allah b'ritzono, katzalik b'ri'uta, when it came upon his will. When? It was a moment in time. Something must have occurred. This thing is always there forever and ever. It's simple and above time. But at some point, this desire came into a strength that action needed to be taken. So what is that, and how is that possible in the divine when you're talking about a simple divine? Does that infer some kind of duality within the divine? So these are really deep philosophical questions, and questions one, I think, ought to ask when one studies these ideas from the Kabbalah. And they are challenging questions, and they do seem to be reminiscent of questions which are found in other traditions related to different aspects of the divine. And I think that this is part of Maimonides' fear of talking about these things. And if you think about the fear which exists not just in Maimonides, but also in other parts of the Torah, even that Mishnah which is referenced by Rabbi Chaim Vital in Chagiga, which says we shouldn't really talk about these things. And he himself says, well, I'm not going to talk much about it, and then goes on to talk about it from a different perspective. But still, it brings up these questions of a dualism within the divine, which for a monotheistic religion really feels somewhat uncomfortable. Anyway, it's fascinating stuff, really deep, interesting conversations and ideas, and we're going to get into it much deeper as we move into the idea of the Tzimtzum. To summarize, we have spoken about the philosophical ideas behind some of these concepts, the eternity of the universe, and how the Kabbalah obviously takes upon the view that the world was created ex nihilo, something from nothing, yesh mi'ayin. What does that mean? Because really, yesh mi'ayin, what is that ayin? What is that nothing? And how does that really sound different than some of the other conversations where they both, especially today, we're not sure what is that nothing. None of us can describe what it is. I think a key difference here in the Kabbalah is that it considers that the Godhead, but then it goes on to describe what that is and things that happened in that Godhead. So really, is it nothing or is it something? Is it something that we can describe? And is there duality in it? And obviously they would argue there is no duality in it. And then what happened? How did this world actually come into being? What was, so we know the mechanism within the divine of how it was decided or how the desire for creation came about. But once that desire came about, what did God do in order to allow for the creation of the universe? And that's where we get into the Tzimtzum, or the Great Contraction, which we're going to get into in the next episode. But meanwhile, this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining.